Section 5 of the Treasure Chest of My Book House. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Michelle Eaton. The Treasure Chest of My Book House, edited by Olive Beaupre Miller. The Magic Horse, the Arabian Nights. Throughout all Persia, the Nowruz, or Festival of the New Year, has always been celebrated with extraordinary rejoicings. Strangers are invited to appear at court, and liberal rewards are given by the Sultan to those who can produce the most wonderful inventions. On one of these feast days, after the most skilful inventors of the country had displayed their devices before the Sultan of Persia, at Shiraz, there suddenly appeared at the foot of the throne, just as the assembly was breaking up, a Hindu with an artificial horse. The horse was richly bridled and saddled, and so wonderfully made that at first sight he looked like a living creature. The Hindu prostrated himself before the throne, and pointing to the horse said to the Sultan, "Sire, of all wonders which you have this day seen, I assure you this horse is the most wonderful. Whenever I mount him, be it where it may, if I wish to transport myself to the most distant part of the world, I can do it in a very short time. This is a marvel which nobody ever heard of, and which I offer to display for your majesty, if you command me." The Sultan, who was fond of everything that was curious, had indeed never beheld or heard of anything that came up to this, so he bade the Hindu perform what he had promised. The Hindu immediately put his foot into the stirrup, and mounted his horse with agility. When he had fixed himself in the saddle, he asked the Sultan where he was pleased to send him. About 3 leagues from Shiraz there was a high mountain visible from the large square before the palace, where the Sultan and his court and great concourse of people were then gathered. "Do you see that mountain?" said the Sultan. "Ride your horse thither, and bring me a branch from the palm tree that grows at the bottom of the hill." The Sultan had no sooner declared his will than the Hindu turned a peg which was in the hollow of the horse's neck, just by the pummel of the saddle. In an instant the horse rose off the ground and carried his rider into the air like lightning, rising to such a great height that the Sultan and all the spectators were struck with admiration. In less than a quarter of an hour they saw him returning with the palm branch in his hand. Before he descended he took 2 or 3 turns in the air amid the acclamations of the people, then alighted on the spot whence he had set off. He dismounted and prostrated himself before the throne, laying the branch of the palm tree at the feet of the Sultan. The Sultan, who had viewed this unheard of sight with no less admiration than astonishment, conceived a great desire to have the horse, and said to the Hindu, "I will buy him of you." "Sire," replied the Hindu, "I beg of you not to be angry with me, but I cannot resign to you my horse except on receiving the hand of the princess your daughter as my wife." The courtiers could not forbear laughing aloud at this extravagant demand of the Hindu, but the Prince Firouz Schah, the Sultan's eldest son and heir to the crown, could not hear it without indignation. "Sire," he said, "I hope you will not hesitate to refuse so insolent a demand, or allow this insignificant juggler to flatter himself for a moment with the idea of being allied to one of the most powerful monarchs in the world." "Son," replied the Sultan, "putting my daughter the princess out of the question, I may still make another agreement with the Hindu, but before I bargain at all, I should be glad that you would examine the horse, try him yourself, and give me your opinion." On hearing this, the Hindu readily ran before the prince to help him mount and show him how to guide and manage the horse. But the prince mounted without the Hindu's assistance, and as soon as he had his feet in the stirrups, without waiting for the artist's advice, he turned the peg he had seen him use. Instantly the horse darted up in the air, quick as an arrow out of a bow. In a few moments neither horse nor prince was to be seen. The Hindu, alarmed at what had happened, prostrated himself before the throne and cried out, "Sire, your majesty yourself saw that the prince was so hasty he would not permit me to give him the necessary instructions how to govern my horse. He knows not how to turn the horse around and bring him back again. I beg you do not hold me accountable for what may happen to him." But the Sultan, perceiving the danger into which his son's impatience had brought him, asked in a passion why the Hindu had not called out instructions to the prince the moment he saw him ascend. "Sire," answered the Hindu, "your majesty saw as well as I with what rapidity the horse flew away. Surprise deprived me of the use of my tongue. But," he added, "there is reason to hope that the prince, when he finds himself at a loss, will perceive another peg. As soon as he turns that, the horse will cease to rise and descend to the ground, when he may turn him to what place he pleases by guiding him with the bridle. Your head shall answer for my son's life if he does not return safe in 3 days' time," cried the sultan, and he ordered his officers to secure the Hindu and keep him close prisoner, after which he retired to his palace in great affliction. In the meantime, Prince Firouz Schah was carried through the air with prodigious swiftness, and in less than an hour's time he had got so high that he could not distinguish anything on the earth. Mountains and plains seemed confounded together. It was then he began to think of returning, and thought to do it by turning the same peg he had used before, only the contrary way, pulling the bridle at the same time. But when he found that the horse still continued to ascend, his alarm was great. He turned the peg several times one way and the other, but all in vain. It was then he saw his fault, and apprehended the great danger he was in from not having waited to learn how to guide the horse before he mounted. He examined the horse's head and neck with great attention, and at length perceived behind the right ear another peg, smaller than the first. He turned that peg, and immediately the horse began to descend in the same oblique manner as he had mounted, but not so swiftly. Night had overshadowed that part of the earth over which the prince was flying when he discovered the small peg, and as the horse descended, he by degrees lost sight of the sun till it grew quite dark, insomuch that instead of choosing what place he would go to, he was obliged to let the bridle lie upon the horse's neck and wait patiently till he alighted, though not without dread lest it should be in the desert, a river, or the sea. At last, after midnight, the horse reached the ground, and the prince dismounted, very faint and hungry, having eaten nothing since the morning when he came out of the palace with his father to assist at the festival. He found himself to be on the terrace of a magnificent palace, surrounded with a balustrade of white marble breast high, and groping about, reached a staircase. None but Prince Firouz Schah would have ventured to go down those stairs, dark as they were and exposed to danger, but he said to himself, "I do not come to do anybody any harm, so whoever meets me and finds me unarmed will attempt nothing against me without hearing what I have to say for myself." After this reflection he went softly down the stairs and came to a landing place where he found a door opening into an apartment that had a light in it. The prince stopped, and listening, heard no other sound within than the snoring of some people who were fast asleep. He advanced a little into the room, and by the light of the lamp saw that those persons were black chamberlains with naked sabres laid by them, which was enough to inform him that this was the guard chamber of some queen or princess. Prince Firouz Schah advanced on tiptoe without waking the chamberlains, and drew aside the silken curtain that hung before an inner room. There he saw a magnificent chamber containing many beds, one alone being on a raised day, and the others on the floor. The princess slept in the first, and her women in the others. He crept softly towards the day, and there beheld a beauty so extraordinary that he was charmed at first sight. Gently he woke the princess. She opened her eyes, and seeing a handsome young man was in great surprise, yet showed no sign of fear. The prince bowed himself to the ground and said, "Beautiful princess, by the most extraordinary and wonderful adventure, you see at your feet a suppliant prince, son of the Sultan of Persia. Pray afford him your assistance and protection." The personage to whom Firouz Schah so happily addressed himself was the Princess of Bengal, eldest daughter of the Rajah of that kingdom, who had built this palace at a small distance from his capital, whither she went to enjoy the country. After she had heard the prince, she replied with kindness, "Prince, hospitality, humanity, and politeness are to be met within the kingdom of Bengal as well as in Persia. I grant you the protection you ask. You may depend on what I say." The Prince of Persia would have thanked the Princess of Bengal for her kindness, but she would not give him leave. "Notwithstanding my desire," said she, "to know by what miracle you have come hither from the capital of Persia in so short a time, and how you have been able to come to my apartment and escape the vigilance of my guards, as you must want some refreshment, I will postpone my curiosity and give orders to many women to regale you, and show you to a room where you may rest after your fatigue." The princess's women each took a wax candle, and after the prince had taken leave very respectfully, they went before him and conducted him into a handsome chamber, where they brought him all sorts of meats. When he had eaten, they left him to repose. In the meantime, the Princess of Bengal was so struck with the intelligence, politeness, and other good qualities which she had discovered in that short conversation with the prince, that she could not sleep. But when her women came into her room again, she asked them if they had taken care of him, and more particularly what they thought of him. The women answered, "We do not know what you may think of him, but for our part we think you would be very happy if the Rajah, your father, would marry you to so amiable a prince, for there is not a prince in all the kingdom of Bengal to compare with him, nor can we hear that any of the neighbouring princes are worthy of you." Nothing went forward for several days following this but concerts of music, accompanied with magnificent feasts in the garden, or hunting parties in the vicinity of the palace, which abounded with all sorts of game, stags and deer, and other beasts peculiar to the kingdom of Bengal. After the chase, the prince and princess met in some beautiful spot where a carpet was spread and cushions laid for their accommodation. There, resting themselves, they conversed on various subjects. For 2 whole months Prince Firouz Schah remained the guest of the Princess of Bengal, taking part in all the amusements she arranged for him. But after that time he declared seriously that he could not stay any longer, and begged her to give him leave to return to his father, repeating a promise he had made to her to return soon in a style worthy of her and of himself, to demand her in marriage of the Rajah. "And, princess," observed the Prince of Persia, "that you may not doubt the truth of my affection, I would presume, were I not afraid you would be offended at my request, to ask the favour of taking you along with me to visit my father the Sultan." The princess returned no answer to this address of the Prince of Persia, but her silence and downcast eyes were sufficient to inform him that she had no reluctance to accompany him into Persia. The next morning, therefore, a little before daybreak, they went upon the terrace of the palace. The prince turned the horse's head towards Persia, and the princess was no sooner up behind him, with her arms about his waist for better security, than he turned the peg, when the horse mounted into the air. In 2 hours' time the prince discovered the capital of Persia. The prince could not alight in the palace of his father, but directed his course towards a small kiosk at a little distance from the capital. He led the princess into a handsome apartment, where he told her that, to do her all honour, he would go and inform his father of their arrival, and return to her immediately. He ordered the attendants of the palace, whom he summoned, to provide the princess with whatever she had occasion for. Having then taken leave of the princess, he left the artificial horse and ordered a real one to be brought. This he mounted and set out for the palace. As he passed through the streets, he was received with acclamations by the people, who were overjoyed to see him again. The sultan, his father, was in the midst of his council when his son appeared before him. He received the prince with tears of joy, and embracing him, asked what had been his adventures. The question gave the prince an opportunity of describing what had happened to him, and the affection he and the Princess of Bengal entertained for each other, and how he had persuaded her to accompany him into Persia, and desired his father's consent to their marriage. After these words, the sultan embraced his son a second time, and said, "Son, I not only consent to your marriage with the Princess of Bengal, but will go and meet her myself, thank her for the obligation I am under to her, bring her to my palace, and celebrate your wedding this day." The sultan now ordered that the Hindu should be fetched out of prison and brought before him, when he said, "Thanks be to God, my son is returned again. Go take your horse, and never let me see your face more." As the Hindu had learned that Prince Firouz Schah was returned with a princess whom he had left at the kiosk, he thought he would just be beforehand with the prince and the sultan, and have the princess for himself. So, without losing any time, he went direct to the kiosk, and addressing himself to the captain of the guard, told him he came from the Prince of Persia to fetch the Princess of Bengal on the horse to the sultan, who waited in the great square of the palace to gratify the whole court and the city of Shiraz with that wonderful sight. The captain of the guard credited what the Hindu said, and presented him to the Prince of Bengal, who no sooner understood that he came from the Prince of Persia than she consented to what the prince, as she thought, desired of her. The Hindu, overjoyed at the ease with which he had accomplished his villainy, mounted his horse, took the princess before him, and turned the peg, whereat the horse mounted instantly into the air. At the same time the sultan, with his entire court, was on the way from his palace to the kiosk, and the Prince of Persia had ridden on before to prepare the princess to receive his father. To defy them both and revenge himself for the ill treatment he had received, the Hindu appeared directly over their heads with his prize. When the Sultan of Persia saw the Hindu, he stopped. His surprise and affliction were keen. He loaded him with 1,000 imprecations, as did also all his courtiers, but the Hindu, little moved by their curses, continued his way, while the Sultan went back to his palace in rage and vexation. But what was Prince Firouz Schah's grief to see the Hindu carry away the princess whom he loved so dearly. At so unexpected a sight he was thunderstruck, and before he could make up his mind what to do, the horse was out of sight. He continued his way therefore to the kiosk where he had left the princess. When he arrived, the captain of the guard, who had learned how he had been deceived, threw himself at the prince's feet, and, with tears in his eyes, accused himself of the crime which he had unintentionally committed. "Rise up," said the prince to him. "I do not impute the loss of my princess to you, but to my own want of precaution. But lose no more time. Fetch me a dervish's robe at once, and take care that you do not give the least hint it is for me." Not far from this place there stood a convent of dervishes, the superior of which was the particular friend of the captain of the guard. From him the captain readily obtained a complete dervish's habit, and carried it to Prince Firouz Schah. The prince immediately put it on, and being so disguised, left the palace, uncertain which way to go, but resolved never to return until he had found out his princess. Meantime the Hindu, mounted on his enchanted horse with the princess before him, arrived early that evening at the capital of the kingdom of Kashmir. Being hungry, he alighted in an open part of the wood, and left the princess on a grassy spot, close to a rivulet of fresh water, while he went to seek for food. During the Hindu's absence, the princess, knowing that she was in the power of a base deceiver, whose violence she dreaded, thought of getting away from him and seeking a sanctuary, but the Hindu discovered her and dragged her back with great violence. The princess made stout resistance, and her cries and shrieks soon drew to the spot the Sultan of Kashmir and his attendants who chanced to be passing. The Sultan, addressing himself to the Hindu, demanded who he was and wherefore he ill-treated the lady. The Hindu, with great impudence, replied that she was his wife, and what had anyone to do with his quarrel with her? The princess, who knew neither the rank nor the quality of the person who came so seasonably to her relief, exclaimed, "Sir, whoever you are, whom heaven has sent to my assistance, have compassion on a princess, and give no credit to that impostor. He is a wicked magician who has stolen me away from the Prince of Persia, to whom I was going to be married, and has brought me hither on the enchanted horse you behold there." The Princess of Bengal had no occasion to say more. Her beauty, majestic air, and tears declared that she spoke the truth. Justly enraged at the insolence of the Hindu, the Sultan ordered his guards to surround him and strike off his head, which sentence was immediately executed. The Sultan then conducted the princess to his palace, where he lodged her in the most magnificent apartment, and commanded a great number of women slaves to attend her. Princess of Bengal's joy was inexpressible at finding herself delivered from the Hindu, of whom she could not think without horror. She flattered herself that the Sultan of Kashmir would complete his generosity by sending her back to the Prince of Persia, where she should have told him her story and asked that favor of him. But she was much deceived in these hopes, for her deliverer had resolved to marry her himself the next day, and to that end had issued a proclamation commanding the general rejoicing of the inhabitants of the capital. At the break of day drums were beaten, trumpets sounded, and the whole palace echoed with music and joy. When the Sultan of Kashmir came to wait upon the Princess of Bengal, he informed her that all those rejoicing were in honor of their wedding, and at the same time desired her to agree to the marriage. This declaration threw her into such a state of agitation that rather than break the promise she had made to Prince Firouz Schah by consenting to marry the Sultan of Kashmir, she resolved to feign madness. She began to utter the most extravagant expressions before the Sultan, and ever rose off her seat as if to fly at him, insomuch that the Sultan was very much surprised and greatly afflicted that he should have made his proposal so unseasonably. When he found that her frenzy rather increased than abated, he left her with her women, charging them never to leave her alone, but to take great care of her. He sent often that day to inquire how she did, but received no other answer than that she was rather worse than better. So the Sultan was induced to send for all the physicians about his court to ask if they could cure her. When he saw that they could not, he called in the most celebrated and experienced physicians of the city, who had no better success. He then sent for the most famous in the kingdom, and to neighbouring courts, but all with no effect. During this interval, Firouz Schah, disguised in the habit of a dervish, had travelled through a great many provinces and towns. Full of grief, and having endured much fatigue, not knowing which way to direct his course, he made diligent inquiry after his lost princess at every place he came to. At last, passing through a city of Hindustan, he heard the people talk much of a princess of Bengal, who had become mad on the day of her intended marriage to the Sultan of Kashmir. Supposing that there could exist no other princess of Bengal, he had hastened toward the kingdom of Kashmir, and upon his arrival at the capital, took up his lodging at a khan, where the same day he was informed of the story of the princess and the fate of the Hindu magician. The prince was convinced he had at last found the beloved object whom he had sought so long. Being informed of all particulars, he provided himself with a physician's habit, and went boldly to the palace, announcing to the chief of the officers his wish to be allowed to undertake the cure of the princess. Some time had elapsed since any physician had offered himself, and the Sultan of Kashmir had begun to lose all hope of ever seeing the princess restored to herself. Therefore he lost no time in ordering the officer to introduce the new physician. The sultan then told the prince that the Princess of Bengal could not bear the sight of a physician without falling into the most violent transports. Accordingly, he conducted the prince into a closet whence he might see her without being observed. There Firouz Schah beheld his lovely princess, looking very melancholy, and singing an air in which she deplored the unhappy fate which had deprived her, perhaps forever, of the prince whom she loved so tenderly. The prince was much affected by the melancholy condition in which he found his beloved princess, but he at once comprehended that her madness was but a pretence. When he came away, he told the sultan that he had discovered the nature of her ailment, but added that, in spite of the manner in which she took on at sight of a physician, he must speak to her in private. The sultan ordered the princess's door to be opened, and Firouz Schah went in. As soon as the princess saw him, she resorted to her old practice of violence on meeting physicians, but he made directly towards her, and when he was nigh enough for her to hear, and no one else, he said in a low voice, "Princess, I am not a physician, but the Prince of Persia." The princess, who knew the sound of his voice and recognized his features, notwithstanding he had let his beard grow long, became calm at once, and a secret joy and pleasure overspread her face. Firouz Schah then told her, as briefly as possible, his own adventures, and she informed him of all that had happened to her, how she had feigned to be mad, because she saw no other way to preserve herself for a prince to whom she had given her heart and faith. The Prince of Persia then asked if she knew what had become of the horse, to which she answered that she did not, but she supposed after the account she had given to the sultan of it, he would preserve it as a curiosity. The Sultan of Kashmir was overjoyed when the Prince of Persia stated to him how calmly the princess had received him, and what effort his first visit had had toward her recovery. In order to introduce the subject of the horse, the prince then inquired of the sultan how the princess had come into the kingdom of Kashmir thus alone, when her own country was so far distant. The sultan at once informed him, adding that he had ordered the horse to be kept safe, though he knew not how to use it. "Sire," replied Firouz Schah, "the information which your majesty has given me affords me a means of restoring the princess. As she was brought hither on this horse, and the horse is enchanted, she hath contracted somewhat of the enchantment, which can be dissipated only by a certain incense I know of. If your majesty would entertain yourself, your court, and the people of your capital with the most surprising sight that ever you beheld, let the horse be brought tomorrow into the great square before the palace, and leave the rest to me. I promise to show you and all that assembly in a few moments the Princess of Bengal completely recovered." The sultan would have undertaken much more difficult things to have secured his marriage with the princess. Moreover, he was greatly encouraged by the improvement already made, so the next day the enchanted horse was by his order taken out of the treasury and placed in the great square before the palace. A report was spread through the town that there was something extraordinary to be seen, and crowds of people flocked thither from all parts, insomuch that the sultan's guards were placed about to prevent disorder, and to keep space enough round the horse. The Sultan of Kashmir, surrounded by all his nobles and ministers of state, was placed in a gallery erected on purpose. The Princess of Bengal, attended by a number of women whom the sultan had assigned to her, went up to the enchanted horse, and the women helped her to mount. When she was fixed in the saddle, and had the bridle in her hand, the Prince of Persia placed round the horse at a proper distance many vessels full of lighted charcoal, which he had ordered to be brought, and going round them with a solemn pace, cast in handfuls of incense. Then, with downcast eyes and his hands upon his breast, he ran 3 times about the horse, making as if he pronounced some mystical words. The moment the pot sent forth a dark cloud of smoke, accompanied with a pleasant smell, which so surrounded the princess that neither she nor the horse was to be discerned, the prince, watching his opportunity, jumped nimbly up behind her, and reaching his hand to the peg, turned it. Just as the horse rose with them into the air, he pronounced these words, which the sultan heard distinctly: "Sultan of Cashmere, when you would marry a princess who implores your protection, learn first to obtain her consent." Thus the prince delivered the Princess of Bengal, and carried her the same day to the capital of Persia, where he alighted in the midst of the palace, before the window of the sultan his father. The sultan deferred the marriage only so long as was required to make preparations to render the ceremony magnificent. After the days appointed for the rejoicing were over, the Sultan of Persia at once sent an ambassador to the Rajah of Bengal to give him an account of what had happened and ask his approval of the marriage. This the Rajah of Bengal took as an honor, and was pleased to grant with satisfaction. End of section 5.